Thank you, Tujapurkar ji. It's indeed a great pleasure and an honor to address the All India Bank Employees Association. This is a very, very important association which is very relentlessly for a very long time trying to prevent the privatization of banks in this country, which is a very important public service that they have been that you have been rendering. As Mr. Tuljapurkar pointed out, and as we all know, banks are supposed to be custodians of public money. It's the money of the common man which is deposited in the banks. And that is why bank nationalization was done such a long time ago, almost 50 years ago. The reason was that there was a correct understanding that private entities and private institutions should not be holding charge of the money of the general public, particularly the common people of this country. And therefore, the banks were nationalized. Unfortunately, what has been happening over the last many years is that our public sector banks and of course the private sector banks also. Firstly, we must understand that though NPAs, what are called non-performing assets, or that is bad debts of public sector banks, have been growing by leaps and bounds over the last many years. And a lot of it is on account of very, very large corporate lending to crony capitalists of the government, and the public sector banks have been virtually forced to lend money to these crony capitalists on the pressure of the government, as we saw in that case where State Bank was virtually forced to give a guarantee for a loan of 6,000 plus crores that Adani was taking for their coal mining project in Australia. So there is no doubt that public sector banks and financial institutions have been, to a substantial extent, plundered and allowed to be plundered. Their money has been allowed to be lent to crony capitalists of the government, cronies of the government, who were not worthy of being given those funds. Very often, these debts, which become bad debts, are rolled over in what is called corporate restructuring. And very often, fresh loans are given to the same cronies who have defaulted on their earlier loans, sometimes in the very same companies where the defaults have taken place. But we need to understand that these scams are not limited only to public sector banks. I'll come to the question of what is the solution to this, to these bank scams and bad debts, non-performing assets, etc. But first, we need to understand that this is not limited only to public sector banks. In fact, private banks also, as we have seen recently in the ICICI Bank, Yes Bank, many other banks in the private sector, they have also been subjected to a lot of bank fraud. In fact, there though we have seen more direct fraud, where the people who have controlling interest or who control, the private people who control those banks, have been lending money to their friends, who have in turn lent money to their shell companies or their own private companies, etc. These kind of scams are galore in the private banks. So therefore, the fact that the view or the sense that some people have that these scams are taking place only because these banks are in the public sector and the scams will not take place if they were in the private sector is not true, because the money that the banks are dealing with is public money. It is not really the money of the owners of the banks. If it was the money of the owners of the banks, then one can understand that they will be very wary about giving loans to people who are unworthy of being given those loans, that they will guard their money more carefully rather than the directors of public sector banks who are dealing with public money, because private banks are also dealing with public money. And that is why we have seen that those scams have happened, and even worse scams have happened in private banks. So, and what we have been saying throughout, is that in order to deal with this problem, what we need is firstly complete transparency about the functioning of our banks. And we have been fighting for that. I filed a PIL about this long time back, and it was only as a result of that PIL that this concept of willful defaulters also was evolved by the Reserve Bank. In that, we had said that there should be complete transparency about any defaults. That means if there is any default by any borrower from the bank, the facts about that default should be out and put out on a public website, which should be accessible to the people. Secondly, we had said that those people who have defaulted should not be given further loans, and those people who have siphoned out money, who are now called willful defaulters, they should be barred from being given loans in the future. And it is not merely those companies. It should be all companies owned by the same promoters or the same promoters. So if you have a promoter who has set up several companies, all his companies of the promoter who is found to be a willful defaulter of even one loan should be barred from getting loans for any of his other promoted companies. And there should be complete transparency so that people can see who are the defaulters, for how long have they been defaulters, whether these defaulters, this evergreening of loans or corporate debt restructuring as it is called, whether this is being done, whether they are being given any fresh loans, etc. All that should be accessible on a public website. Unfortunately, banks have been raising this issue. They have been trying to conceal all information about their defaults, etc., from the people. And even when this issue of whether this information about defaulters, about Reserve Bank inspection reports being accessible to the general public under the RTI Act, when this issue came up, these banks, especially the RBI, went to the Supreme Court to challenge the orders issued by the Central Information Commission, saying that this is information which should be accessible under the RTI Act. So there were 10 cases which were decided by the Central Information Commission, holding that all this information, including defaults, including this Reserve Bank inspection reports, etc. All this information should be accessible to the public. At that time, before the Supreme Court, the Reserve Bank argued that no, this will compromise the economic stability of the country. This will compromise the private interests of these people who borrow money from the banks, etc. Every kind that this is fiduciary information, therefore it cannot be given out by the RBI. All these arguments were raised. Each one of those arguments were dealt with and comprehensively rejected. Even after that, and Reserve Bank was ordered to grant that, give that information. Even after that, Reserve Bank did not, and in fact issued a circular to the bank saying that these kind of information should not be given out. We went to the Supreme Court again with a contempt petition, and in that contempt petition, they were told that you better give this information, otherwise somebody will be sent to jail. Thereafter, they were forced to start giving that information. But then these individual banks went to the court. One after another, 10, 12 banks went to the court and obtained an ex parte stay against a judgment of the Supreme Court. Then we intervened in the matter, and thereafter those applications were dismissed. Now they have filed writ petitions saying that this judgment should not be applied to us. Now those writ petitions are going to be heard in another week or so. But what the point that I'm making is that these banks, especially public sector banks, they have no business to say that this information, they are dealing with public money. They are all public servants. All these directors of these various banks, etc. They have no business to say. And the only reason why they are saying that this information should not be given out is because they are acting in the interests of these crony capitalists who are being given loans at the instance on under pressure of the government, etc. Sometimes even for corrupt considerations, that these people are being given money and they want to hide that information from the public. So one of the most important measures to stop these kind of bank scams is to ensure complete transparency about especially about defaults. All information about all defaulters, whether they are willful defaulters or not, must be completely transparent, put out on the website so that every member of the public can see. Then only we will see, we will be able to see whether scams are taking place or not, whether defaulters are being given further loans, whether corporate restructuring is being done, whether their other companies are being given loans, etc., etc. One other issue which we had also gone to court about on behalf of the Bank Officers Association was that there is a provision for employee directors. Each of these banks must have employee directors. That's the requirement of law. But yet this was not being done. There were a very large number of banks who did not have employee directors. And yet it was continuing like that. We went to court. The Delhi High Court directed them to have employee directors. But even now, for even 3 years down the line, 3 years ago, this direction was given to these banks to have employee directors. But even now, many banks have still not appointed employee directors. These employee directors would at least be able to keep an eye on what's happening, raise these issues before the board, etc. But unfortunately, even this is not being done. Recently, there have been stories in the Indian Express, which you must have read, about how so-called independent directors in various financial institutions, PSUs, etc., are being appointed who are just politicians from the ruling party. That is, the BJP has appointed more than 50% of the so-called independent directors in various PSUs today are members of the BJP who have no qualification to be appointed independent directors in that. Secondly, large number of them, substantial percentage of them are persons, bureaucrats who retired from the government and who retired from positions where they were supposed to be regulating those very companies on whose boards they have been appointed as so-called independent directors. Now, this is a clear conflict of interest, and this is happening even with banks now, that people who retire from the Reserve Bank of India are being appointed as so-called independent directors of these banks, private and public banks. That's not proper. That's against the rules. That's a conflict of interest. But unfortunately, this is also being done. So, so therefore, what we need to deal with these bank scams, this burgeoning problem, as I said, see, most of the non-performing assets are due to very large corporate debtors who, if you look at them, are essentially cronies of various governments, and through them they exercise that power, or they have corrupted the directors of these banks. And the way to deal with that is firstly complete transparency, proper systems of accountability, not allowing this kind of independent directors, so-called independent directors who have conflicts of interest, who were earlier with the Reserve Bank or with other regulators, etc., appointing the employee directors, etc., and putting in place rules which just prohibit defaulters, particularly willful defaulters. Willful defaulters should be completely barred. All their companies floated by the same promoters should be completely barred. So that is the solution, not privatization. Just because the banks are being, public sector banks are subjected to these NPAs and scams, etc., the answer to that is not wholesale privatization. It's like saying that there is corruption in the judiciary, therefore privatize the judiciary. There is corruption in the police, therefore privatize the police. You cannot privatize the police. You cannot privatize the judiciary. It's a public institution for public benefit, just as banks are public institutions for public benefit, holding public money. And therefore, solution is not privatization. Solution is fixing whatever is wrong with them and fixing the problem at the root. That is fixing the lending itself, fixing the lending to ensure that lending is not made to people who are not worthy of these loans. The system of appraisal of loans, this is also non-transparent. At least for substantial loans, we must know how the banks have appraised those loans, whether this person is credit worthy or not. That thing should also be put out in the open. I am totally opposed to this business of hiding. This is public money that we are dealing with. So where is the question of privacy or secrecy, etc., in dealing with public money? If somebody is being given a loan, we must know why is being given a loan. We must know what is the credit appraisal of that person, who has done that credit appraisal, what does it say? Therefore, all those things need to be known and put out in the public domain. That's the best guarantee. And instead of privatization, what we need to do is to repair these systems, set up these proper systems, fill up all the jobs. Today, what is happening is that there are so many posts which are vacant in banks, in other PSUs, in other government institutions, which are not being filled up. Today, when people are starving for jobs, the even the government jobs and the posts which are there are not being filled up. There are 2.5 lakh people who sit for these government jobs and various exams every year, or who are aspiring to those government jobs, but these posts are not being filled. And every day we are seeing that there are scams erupting in the whole method of recruiting people for these jobs. And even the banking sector is not immune to that, to the scams in recruitment of employees, etc. So therefore, that is also happening, and we need to set that right as well. So, I just wanted to say one thing at the end. See, I'm not an expert in the banking industry, so I'm not dealing much with the bankruptcy code. Unfortunately, what has happened is that with the coming of this bankruptcy code, uh, there are a number of companies which have been purchased at sometimes even 1/10 or 1/20th the amount of loans outstanding, which means that banks have been forced to take haircuts in many of these companies to the extent of 90% or 95%. And sometimes the money for purchasing these companies under the bankruptcy code is also taken as loans from these very banks. And the assets of the bankrupt company are offered as collateral security, etc. So even the functioning of the bankruptcy code leaves much to be desired. That matter needs to be thoroughly examined. But as I said, I'm not an expert on that. Therefore, I'm not going to say much about that. I'll only speak about things which I understand reasonably well or fairly well. So one thing at the end I wanted to say, that there is, of course, a need to fill up all these government jobs which are lying vacant. Of course, there is no justification for privatizing banks at any rate, or for that matter, any public institution where there is a strong public interest element involved in the functioning of that institution. There may be some companies which have no great public interest involved. They are like any other commercial company. Those could be privatized, but certainly not banks which are dealing with huge sums of public money. These certainly should not be privatized. All these jobs should be filled. And I feel that the time has come for this country to have a law providing for right to employment. Every adult citizen of this country has a right to get employment, at least at minimum wages. And if the government is not able to provide employment, today this problem of unemployment has become so huge, especially after these lockdowns, etc., so huge that there are crores of people, crores of families who have become totally destitute. And when the Supreme Court said that the right to life includes the right to live with dignity, which means at least the right to have employment at minimum wages, that's a basic human right of every citizen, every adult. And that there should be a law which puts that into place. We brought a law called Narega, which provides employment at minimum wages to at least one person from each rural family. That needs to be expanded for 100 days. That needs to be expanded to cover all adults, rural and urban, and for the entire year, failing which the government should give unemployment allowance at least half those minimum wages. This is an issue whose time has come in this country, and everybody, including the Bank Employees Association. Of course, these jobs will be at minimum wages, but at least the poor people in this country who are totally destitute, who have nothing at all, need to be given these jobs, or at least that unemployment allowance. That's an issue whose time has come. And I hope that the All India Bank Employees Association will also, we will be hopefully launching a campaign about this in some time to come. And I hope that the Bank Employees Association will also participate in that campaign, though it's not an issue which directly affects the bank employees. As I said, it's a uh, it's a multi-pronged approach. Uh, there should be no privatization in these sectors. All the available jobs and the posts which are lying vacant should be filled up. And in addition to that, there needs to be a right to employment. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.